Welcome here to our third public presentation by our Esau Distinguished Visiting Professors this year, which is organized by the International Development Studies Program at Menno Simons College. The series is entitled How We Grow, Share, and Eat, Moving Towards Just and Sustainable Food and Farming Systems. The presentation tonight is entitled Feeding the World, Is Hunger Inevitable? And it will be given by Dr. Haroon Akram-Lodhi, who's the chair of the International Development Studies Program at Trent University. And I'll introduce Dr. Akram-Lodhi in just a minute. I want to give some background points about the topic and about Menno Simons College first. Just going to take about 5 minutes. So first of all, the importance of this topic I don't think can be understated. Food, as we know, is so intrinsic to our well-being, and yet in our burgeoning economy and fast-paced information communication-based society, often we maybe miss the importance of food. But food security is so important, as is farming. And again, with an urban population now, over 50% of the world's population are urban-based, and of course in Canada, much higher percentage. Maybe we miss the importance of the farm and the sustainability of the farm. This is a complex question, the question of food security and farm sustainability. And the presentation tonight is one of 6 that are looking at this topic and are a part of Menno Simons College's effort to address a very serious social and economic challenge. And we realize that this is a complex topic that involves multiple voices, multiple perspectives, from perspectives that focus on globalization, those that focus on localization, reliance on high tech as a solution versus social change, economic efficiency sometimes is opposed to environmental sustainability. We recognize that this is a complex challenge, and we at Menno Simons College are interested to unpack this and seek to understand it. So just, you know, there's those statistics that many of us are familiar with that haunt us year after year, and those statistics find that there are many people who are hungry. So depending on the indicator, that ranges from 800 to, in this case, 925 million people. So just under 1 billion people are hungry. And this is in a world where there are many people. One statistic suggests 1 billion people who are overfed. So we live in a world of stark contrasts. And how do we understand this? Like, how can we understand what's going on here? That is what the intention of this series is to do. By way of background, this series is organized by Menno Simons College, which is a college of Canadian Mennonite University and affiliated with the University of Winnipeg. And we offer programs in international development, conflict resolution. We have a series of courses that look at the intersection between development and peace, both at the community level and the international level. And we have a long-standing and successful practicum program. As I said, it's a 6-part series. The series is funded by our Esau Endowment, and it's comprised of a number of features. We have the 6 lectures. We have 3 courses that are being offered in the winter term, 2 at Menno Simons College, 1 at the Shaftesbury campus of Canadian Mennonite University. And so if there are any students or others interested in taking these courses, please come and talk to us after the presentation. And we have a very fulsome website, which is up on the screen there if you're interested to learn more about the project. So we've had 2 speakers so far, Dr. Martin Enns in September, Dr. Shirley Thompson in October, and we have then tonight's special presentation and then 3 more presentations in the new year. And I'll mention the next one. Oh, sorry. I'll mention the next one in at the end of the evening. But let me go to the point at hand here tonight, and that's for me to introduce Dr. Haroon Akram-Lodhi, who has been with us here at Menno Simons College for the week. We spent a week with him. He's having conversations with our International Development Studies program, and it's just been a fabulous week. I've just been amazed at his wisdom, his willingness to share and engage in a whole variety of issues. And we had an opportunity, actually, this afternoon Haroon and some MSC colleagues and myself to visit the North End. And we visited a few different organizations that are working in a variety of development activities there. And we went to Nietzsche Commons, which you may know is an organization that seeks to provide high-quality, reasonably priced food for people in the North End, which has sometimes been called a food desert. We also visited the North End Community Renewal Corporation, which has a project that shuttles people from their North End neighborhood to a grocery store of their choice. So these are efforts in the North End, right here in Winnipeg, to help people meet food security needs. So food security is an international challenge, but it's also very much a local challenge. Okay, back to Dr. Akram-Lodhi. He has a master's degree from Cambridge University. His PhD is from the economics department here at the University of Manitoba. He has a variety of research interests, including political economy of agrarian change, political ecology of sustainable rural livelihoods, and he is a prolific writer. He has several book projects underway and a recent book published, which I'll mention in a minute. He's currently a professor of international development studies at Trent University, and he's chair of the department there. And he teaches a course for the Masters in Development Practice program at Emory University. He's a fellow of Food First. By the way, the director of Food First will be our speaker in February. So there's a connection there. Dr. Akram-Lodhi is also active with the UNDP as a gender and poverty advisor. And then finally, his most recent book is called Hungry for Change, Farmers, Food Justice, and the Agrarian Question, which is available, actually, if you're interested, to purchase because Brunswick Books, the publisher, has copies available at the back. So that's my introduction for Dr. Akram-Lodhi, and please would you join with me to welcome him.
Well, thank you very much, Jerry. And thanks to Menno Simons College for this very kind invitation to be part of the Esau lecture series. I'm in extremely distinguished company. I mean, Shirley, who gave the last lecture, is very well known to me and is quite a remarkable academic, an activist. And of course, Eric, who's coming next, I believe, he's quite a person. So I'm very pleased to be with you tonight, even though I brought the winter with me. I didn't mean to bring the winter with me, but these things do happen. Maybe it's revenge for me leaving. So I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes tonight. And I want to start by saying that we live in times which are quite unusual for our world. In 2007, sometime in May, for the first time in human history, more people started to live in cities than lived in the countryside. For our entire existence as a species, we'd basically been a rural creature. And then 6 years ago, we became urban in the majority for the first time. Sometime in October of 2011, world population moved beyond 7 billion people for the first time. And at some point in the next 15 or 20 years, the population of India is going to become bigger than the population of China. So we're seeing very significant changes in the way in which we, as a human community, interact with our world. So what I want to look at today is this issue of population in relation to the issue of food and hunger. And I want to start by looking at some trends. And if you look at the raw figures on human populations, you'll see that world population took off astronomically after the year 1800. And before the year 1800, the population of the planet never exceeded 1 billion people. And so we hadn't had that many people in the world. And if you bring the story more recently, up to 1950 and beyond, world population takes off even more dramatically. So we have about 2.5 billion in 1950. And of course, today, as I've just said, over 7. And you'll see from this particular diagram that the vast bulk of that population increase has occurred in developing countries. Now, one of the most reliable of the social statistical sciences is demography. The UN Population Division has been producing extremely reliable information on population projections going back more than 50 years. And the UN Population Division's projections for the end of the century put the population of the planet at just under 10.9 billion people. The estimates for 2010 are the estimates as of May of this year. So somewhere about above 7.2 billion now, rising to the end of the century to around 10.9 billion. And I really stress that this is really probably quite a reliable estimate. So over the course of the last 50 years, there's been a massive increase in world population, a massive acceleration in the numbers of people on the planet. So what's caused it? What's caused this very large rise in humanity? Well, population growth, very simply, is caused by birth rates being greater than death rates. More people being born than are dying. Now, over the course of the last 50 years, birth rates and death rates have been falling. In the rich countries, birth rates have declined much more rapidly than death rates. But in the poorer countries, in the developing countries, death rates have declined much more rapidly than birth rates. And most dramatically in developing countries, child death rates have fallen very, very dramatically. And so this change in global planetary population, this increase in the share of developing country population in the world, is a function of death rates very rapidly declining. Even as birth rates go down, death rates go down even more rapidly, and particularly child death rates. And I really want to stress that this is a really good thing. This is a very positive sign of the signs of some of the changes that we've witnessed in the world over the course of the last half century. If you look in this figure from UNICEF with data that goes from 1990 to 2008, and you look at the bar for South Asia, you see an extremely rapid decline in child mortality, under 5 child mortality. A decline that, if I had spoken about this in the late 1980s, around the time the Convention on the Rights of the Child was signed, I would never have forecast this kind of rapid decline. And if you look at Eastern and Southern Africa, again, very rapid decline. The least developed countries, the poorest 49 countries of the world, very rapid decline. So no matter whatever you call this thing that we call development, this is really good news, that children are far less likely to die now than was the case 50 years ago. And the thing about this decrease in child deaths is a lot of it has been brought about by programs which are really quite remarkably cheap. Promotion programs that educate people about the importance of washing their hands, programs which provide free soap. These things save many, many lives around the world. And so over the course of the last 50 years, population growth in poor countries has greatly exceeded population growth in the rich countries. But this then begs a question. Can the world support a population of 7 billion people plus? Can the world support a population of 10.9 billion in 2100? Can the world's finite resources manage this number of people? And most particularly, is not the corollary of a world of 7 billion people a world of hunger? Well, here we have the World Food Programme's hunger map for 2012. And quite simply, the darker the color, the more prevalent undernourishment is. And unfortunately, in this particular hunger map, the countries that are gray, which are very important countries, we don't actually know what the prevalence of hunger is. So in countries like Sudan, South Sudan, the DRC, Mauritania, Afghanistan, we don't know. But these countries, we can assume hunger is very prevalent. You will note that the darker colors are all in sub-Saharan Africa, with the exception of Bolivia and Paraguay in South America. So sub-Saharan Africa in particular is an area where we find very severe hunger. Jerry's just said the World Food Programme has an estimate of 925 million people hungry in the world. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, who produced the State of Food Insecurity in the World, their publication this year, 2013, gives the number of 842 million, but that's only for developing countries. And there are many hungry people in the developed world. The number of hungry people in the world has come down. And the Food and Agriculture Organization in particular points to quite rapid declines in the numbers of hungry as they calculate it. But I'm a bit more pessimistic about these figures, whether we're talking about 842 million or 925 million. And that's because these figures are based upon the calorie intake that's needed for a sedentary life. And if you use a calorie intake which is needed for a physically active life, if someone's going out to work, going out in order to make a living, the number of hungry, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, shoots up quite dramatically to almost 1.35 billion. And even more dramatically, that number hasn't changed very much in 40 years. So if we use a more accurate figure, something I consider a more accurate figure, a figure of what's needed to be active, we've had very little reduction in hunger over the course of the past 40 years, even as populations have grown. But whether we use the figure of 842 million, whether we use the figure of 925 million, whether we use the figure of 1.35 billion, in any one of these instances, we live in a world of widespread chronic hunger. And I would argue that it's a very common, very popular, and in some ways quite intuitive belief that population must be related to this question of hunger. That population must have a causal role somehow in the fact that so many people are hungry. Now, this argument that population fosters hunger is a very old argument in political economy, dating back to Thomas Malthus in the early 18th century. And his argument was very, very simple in his Principles of Political Economy. He argued that food supplies will grow arithmetically, but population grows geometrically. Now, what does that mean? It means very simply, food supplies will go up 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2, but population will grow 2 squared, which will be squared, which will be squared. And then you see this kind of difference in this, this particular graph here, in which you have a finite number of resources, and the rate of growth of those resources is linear and stable, whereas the population growth is more exponential. And so you reach a point of crisis in which the population outstrips the resource base that is necessary to feed it. In the Principles of Political Economy, Malthus says, quote, "The power of population is so superior to the power of the earth to produce subsistence for man that premature death must in some shape visit the human race, that it is inevitable that we will have famines and famine-related deaths because the driving factors for population are inexorably greater than the ability to produce their subsistence." Modern followers of Malthus believe that at some point population growth must be faster than the growth of food, causing hunger as a means of re-establishing balance between food and population. And this is, in the literature, is called an idea, food availability decline, or FAD, F-A-D, that the amount of food declines because there's not enough food for an available population, generating immense scarcity. Believers in food availability decline are very widespread. If I can think of one of Canada's leading environmental intellectuals, Thomas Homer Dixon at the Balsillie School, he is a very strong proponent of a Malthusian type argument that population simply population growth is a major causal factor in terms of hunger. And if you believe in food availability decline, you would have a view that the current numbers of hungry people are driven by current rates of population growth, and that drives down per person availability. And so the demand for food outstrips the supply of food, and this would then be responsible for the recent rise in food prices that we've seen over the course of the past 6 years. Because food prices in the past 6 years have reached historically unprecedented levels. Last year in particular, they reached levels that had never been seen before. They've come down a little bit since last year, but if we look at the level of food prices compared to only a few years ago, We've never had food as expensive on a global scale as we do these days. And in the international development community, there's a growing sense amongst many people that there is some kind of global food crisis witnessed in these rising prices, which, as I've said, some would argue, is driven by the number of people on the planet. Now, there has been a food crisis generated by this increase in food prices. It's pushed at least 100 million and possibly as many as 150 million back into poverty from which they only recently emerged. The numbers of people pushed back into poverty by rising food prices has been the equivalent of a decade's worth of poverty reduction around the world. We've also seen global numbers of hungry remain or exceed the 1 billion level. And this idea of Malthus, that there's some kind of potential Malthusian crisis, the idea has been very strongly resurrected. Now, for population growth to cause these increases in food prices and to cause hunger, you basically have to demonstrate two things. The first thing you have to demonstrate is that population growth is greater than increases in available food. Yeah? And so that would be therefore you'd have the decline. Yeah? You don't have enough food because there's growth of population. You then have to also show that it's increases in population which is driving these increases in food prices. So let me spend a few minutes looking at these two propositions. Is population growth greater than increases in food supplies? And does increase in population drive increasing food prices? Well, first, here we have world cereal production over a period of some 30 years. The red line is utilization, the blue line is production, and it's just cereals. But cereals are pretty important because more than 60% of our calorie intake consists of 4 cereals. And the thing about it is, the trend line is inexorably upwards, that we produce more and more cereals, and we have continued to produce more and more cereals around the world over the course of the past 30 years. This doesn't quite answer my first question. My first question was somewhat different. Is population growth greater than increases in food supplies? This is total production. So if I want to get a sense of what's happening in terms of growth of population relative to growth of food supplies, I have to look instead at how much is being produced per person. Yeah? What amount of food is being produced globally per person? Here we have per person food production over a much longer period, 1961 to 2009. And when I got this data from the FAO last year, 2009 was the most recent year they had. And this is really quite important information, but it's elementary because, you know, I'm no genius. I can do the calculations myself using freely available data from the Food and Agriculture Organization. And if you look at that world line, which is blue, what you see is that per person food production over a period of almost 50 years inexorably goes up. If you look at the yellow line, which is South America, per person food production goes inexorably upwards. And if you look at the green line, which is Asia, per person food production goes inexorably upwards. And if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, the red line, you do see that food production per person goes down to 1982, but after 1982 it starts to go up per person, and so by 2009 it's higher than it's ever been per person. So the argument that population growth is faster than growth of food supplies, this is simply wrong. The world, in terms of food production, has witnessed historically unprecedented increases in the amount that we produce. And according to the World Food Programme, the world already produces enough food to feed more than 10 billion people. So if we're going to have 10.9 billion by the end of the century, we've almost got enough now to feed that very large population. But that then leads to a really very fundamental and in many ways much more disturbing question. If food production per person has been driven inexorably upwards over the course of the last 50 years, why do we have record hunger? If we have record production, why do we have this record hunger? And where do these record prices come from? So in order to understand that, we have to see what's the driver of this increase in prices. Is it something to do with population? Well, the simple answer, again, is going to be no. There's three main drivers of the increase in food prices that we've witnessed over the course of the last 6 years. The first one is the production of biofuels. Not just ethanol, but also biodiesel. Because if you look at the chart, first of all, on the left-hand side, you can see that massive increase in ethanol production around the world. And if you look at the right-hand chart, which is only for the United States, you'll also see the blue bars. This is the massive increase in the amount of tax credits for ethanol production, because what's happened over the course of the past decade or so is that the Europeans and the Americans have used subsidies to try and create a market for biofuels. The biofuel industry has massively expanded in the developed world, particularly in the United States and in the European Union. In the United States, more than 30% of the maize crop is used to produce biofuels alone. And this crop, as I've said from the right-hand chart, is very heavily subsidized because the United States has been trying to create a market for biofuels in an effort to attain energy self-sufficiency. So grains which could have been used for food are being used for fuel so that we can drive to the supermarket and buy our groceries. And this very large expansion in biofuels has been a major driver of increasing prices of maize in particular around the world, because a lot of it is going into biofuel production. A second driver of this increase in food prices has been financial speculation. Finance responds to movements in prices. The price of food in 2007 started to shoot up, and in 2008 we had a global financial crisis. And in the wake of this global financial crisis, financiers saw food prices going up. Institutional investors moved into food-based financial instruments in a big way, and this was done in order to boost their firm's earnings and, coincidentally, increase their own bonuses. On the left-hand side, or the upper left-hand side, you see the value of financial assets in food markets, and you can see from 2008 through to 2011, they more than double. So there's an extremely large increase in the value of assets in food markets. There's also a changing composition about the financial assets in food markets. That's the lower part of the lower graph, where you've got a change from food traders dominating the market for financial assets in food, and this giving way to food speculators driving this increase in financial assets in food markets. And then that upper right-hand chart is an interesting chart because it, to me, is the strongest argument that I've seen so far about the relationship between finance, financial speculation, and food prices. What you have on the vertical axis are net index positions. This is buying of food contracts and buying of food and other commodity contracts versus selling of food and other commodity contracts. So as long as you're over the zero horizontal line, you are buying more contracts than you are selling. And then on the horizontal axis, we have the price movement. And I'll draw your attention to cocoa, to coffee, to sugar, to corn, to soybeans. All of these net index positions are positive. There's more buying of contracts than there is of selling. And price changes are positive. Some of them very positive, highly positive. Soybeans, it's only about 15 or 20%. But for corn, you're looking at 50%. For coffee, you're looking at 100%. For sugar, where there's not a net index position that's minus or positive, you still got a price increase of 175%. So the buying and selling of these contracts, to me, is an important driver of these increases in prices. Agro-commodity-linked financial instruments are a key investment vehicle for companies like Goldman Sachs. In 2012, By betting on movements in prices, Goldman Sachs reported a profit from these instruments alone of $400 million just on food price movements. Finance makes prices go up, but it also makes prices far more volatile because trading strategies try and effectively hoard contracts for food. And these contracts where they're trying to hoard, this is taking place in very small markets. For example, only 7% of world rice production actually enters global markets. So if you start buying agro-commodity index instruments in rice, and you start buying them in a very large way, this is going to have an effect, a disproportionate effect on prices. So over the course of the past 5 years, we've seen the real farm economy and food production become unhinged from the financialized farm economy and the demand for food contracts. George Soros, who is a financial speculator if ever there was one, has said that commodity index buying strategies are, and I quote, intellectually unsound, potentially destabilizing, and distinctly harmful in their economic consequences, unquote. And that's a speculator. So finance as a second reason driving these prices. The third driver have been diets and expanding meatification. As you can see on the left-hand side, there's been a massive increase in meat production per person in the world. This is over a 50-year period. If that continued up to today, the curve would continue to rise. Increasingly, grain is used not to feed people, but to feed animals. People have been switching from high-starch, low-protein diets to high-protein, low-starch diets, and this has dramatically increased meat consumption, and also, it should be said, dairy consumption as well, to more than 40 kilos of meat per person around the world in 2010. But this average masks huge differences. In the United States and Canada, average meat consumption is about 123 kilos per person. In China, it's about 60 kilos per person. In developing countries as a whole, it's less than 30 kilos per person. And in India, it's less than 10 kilos per person. Now, when the food price crisis started back in 2007, 2008, the argument was made that it was the emerging middle class in developing countries that was driving this rising demand for meat and for dairy. But with this global unevenness in meat consumption, I'd put it to you, it's not rising demand for meat in rapidly growing developing countries that's driving the increased use of grain for animal feed. It's actually continually increasing demand in rich countries and deepening meatification in rich countries that drives up the demand for grain and pushes up grain prices. So the meatification of global diets is principally situated in North America, Australia, and to a lesser extent, but still significantly, in Western Europe. And the meatification of global diets is, in strictly economic terms, a really poor use of resources. As Frances Moore-Lappé, who's the founder of Food First, of which I am a fellow, as she wrote more than 40 years ago, meat in general, but beef in particular, is what she called a reverse protein factory. You need to use 8 calories to produce 1 calorie of beef. And this is also an industry which massively contributes to global warming. So biofuels, speculation, meatification. This, over the course of the past 6 years, has driven up these increases in global food prices. But it's not population growth. And so if we want to understand, then, why there is so much hunger, and yet population doesn't drive the increase in prices, and there's lots of food being produced, then hunger is an outcome of something else. We have to understand, then, how the world food system works if we want to understand hunger. So how does the world food system work? Our current world food system coalesced in the mid-1990s, and you can really date it from 1995, when the Uruguay round of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was signed in Marrakesh, the Marrakesh Accords, and is organized through what Philip McMichael has called a corporate food regime. What is this corporate food regime? Well, the first thing, very importantly, it's predicated on and requires the massive use of fossil fuels throughout industrialized agriculture. It's a food regime which is dominated by global agro-food transnational corporations. And these global agro-food transnational corporations are driven by financial market imperatives to pursue short-term profitability. The corporate food regime is characterized particularly by the global supermarket revolution, which has propelled relentless food commodification. The corporate food regime uses information technologies and historically unsurpassed logistical capabilities. This is done to forge global animal protein commodity chains based upon, in particular, the globalization of confined animal feeding operations, using transgenic organisms as a principal input in the production of feed grains, and is based upon the expansion of large-scale, capital-intensive industrial mega-farms in the United States, here in Canada, in Brazil, Argentina, and elsewhere. The corporate food regime produces mass-produced, standardized, very durable processed food based upon the heavy use of soya and high-fructose corn syrup for the global middle classes. These processed foods have lower profit margins per unit, and therefore to make money you have to shift very large volumes. But the corporate food regime also supplies for the global elite healthy, nutritional, fresh, organic, and green food from around the world, foods which cost much more, have far higher markups, have far higher profit margins. A food system which is sustained by governments, by international institutions, and is sustained by big philanthropy. There's three key things to stress about the character of the corporate food regime. The first one, this is data from 2007. The world food market in 2007 was worth about $4 trillion. Today it's worth, according to economist, about $6 trillion. But the thing about the way in which the distribution of the value added is allocated across this entire food system in the world is that it's squeezed in particular segments. If you look at farms, in 2007, the total agricultural value added produced by farms was about just over $1.5 trillion. But this was spread over 450 million farms, the vast majority of which are less than 2 hectares in size. Then compare that to food retailers. In 2007, the top 10 captured more than $1 trillion in the value of the world food system. So 1/4 of everything went to food retailers, the supermarkets, the large mass catering companies. Raj Patel has demonstrated that this resembles an hourglass, and that's particularly seen in the figure on the left, the hourglass on the left for Western Europe, where you see 600 supermarkets squeezing down how this world food system operates. Even in the United States, food retailers, food and beverage stores altogether, 148,000. It's a much larger segment. That's because this includes mom and pop stores. So food retailers are the ones which really dominate this system. The corporate food regime is a system in which food retailers are able to exert very strong power over the entire food system. So the choice, which is very important as a concept, as an idea, as a value, if you like, within this food system, this choice is embedded within strongly oligopolistic companies who are able to use market power to, in the phrase of one of them, roll prices back. And this is done to the supposed benefit of the consumer, but in reality, it's done for the benefit of the corporate bottom line. Walmart's US margins in 2010 were 7% on sales of $420 billion. This gave it a profit in 2010 of $16.6 billion. 4 years earlier, before the global food crisis, its profit was $11.3 billion from its food sales. So a rise of more than $5 billion over a 4-year period. And just as with Walmart, a number of agro-food transnationals and input supply in food trading, in food manufacturing, and food retailing have had a very good food crisis. The global grain trade is dominated by 4 companies. We call them the ABCD because it's Archer Daniels Midland, it's Bunge, it's Cargill, and it's Dreyfus. Now, Dreyfus is privately owned, so we don't have information about their profitability. But for the ABC, we do have information. So you have Archer Daniel Midland blue, Cargill in yellow, and Bunge in red. And the thing that's really noticeable, the 2007, you've seen this ratcheting up of the profitability of 3 of the 4 major grain traders in the world. And if you do have information for Dreyfus, because there's a little bit of information floating around, their profitability is ratcheted up as well. So it's not just Walmart, and it's not just the grain traders, and it's not just the input suppliers. They've all had a very good crisis. The missing link between the record production that we've seen over the course of the past 6 years, the record prices that we've seen over the course of the past 6 years, the record hunger that we continue to see, the missing link is record profitability. The second issue around the corporate food regime, then, is it's predicated upon a model of production, distribution, and consumption that, in its hydrocarbon dependence and greenhouse gas emissions, significantly worsens climate change and degrades the ecological foundations of the very farm production upon which it depends. In the left-hand pie chart, you see agricultural byproducts responsible for 12.5%. You've got land use and biomass burning responsible for 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of the figures on greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture are disputed, but there's no doubt that the corporate food regime is a significant contributor to the climate change from which developing countries just walked out of in Warsaw today. As Tony Weiss at Western has so eloquently put it, the temperate grain livestock complex of the corporate food regime has a massive ecological footprint. The third issue created by this food system is that since 1995 in particular, before that, yes, but really since 1995, we have seen the consolidation of world market prices for agricultural products, which have meant that smallholder farmers around the world face prices that never reflect their costs of production. Unable to compete against the subsidized exports of American and European exporters who dump their food onto world markets, small-scale peasant farmers face a simple reproduction squeeze. They cannot cover their costs of production, and this generates in much of the developing countries a deepening agrarian crisis. And this deepening agrarian crisis is a significant reason why 3/4 of the global food insecure live in the countryside and spend at least part of their time working the land. They're food insecure because they cannot compete on the basis of what is now a world market price. And as a result, around the world, farmers are forced to give up their livelihoods and leave the land. The ranks of what one person would call a relative surplus population have swollen as what another writer calls the planet of slums has been created. So this then explains the hunger that you see under the corporate food regime. Missing from the logic of how the system operates are those that cannot compete in farming, or those that have been driven off the land and work in poorly paid, insecure, and frequently dangerous informal work. In the corporate food regime, food is relentlessly commodified, and thus, to have access to food, you don't get this access by producing it, you get access to food by using money in food markets. And this is precisely the thing that the poor of the planet do not have. No money and you are hungry, and this is true whether you're talking about Windhoek, Wuhan, or Winnipeg. So the relative surplus population is denied an entitlement to food as a result of the normal, routine, and everyday working of a corporate food regime. The relative surplus population is subject to something that I've called food-based social exclusion, because the food system produces systemic hunger. So, to the question, can we feed the world? The answer must be yes. We already produce enough. To the question, is hunger inevitable? The answer must be no. Current patterns of hunger are an outcome of the structure of our globalized food system. So we need to construct a new food system which ensures a right to food to all. I've got two final points that I really want to make. The first point is that at the heart of the corporate food regime lies a very telling falsehood. If you say something often enough, people come to believe it. What is that falsehood? The falsehood is we need capital-intensive agriculture to feed a world of 10 billion people. Countless scientific studies have demonstrated that agroecological farming can be as productive or more productive than industrial agriculture. The figure on the left is extremely interesting because the Rothamsted Research Institute is the oldest agricultural research center in the world. So it has done research on wheat since 1855. And if you look at that figure, what has the greatest productivity? It's organic manures, not inorganic fertilizers. Organic. And when you compare organic to conventional systems, the yields are usually at least as good, sometimes better. The earnings they generate, usually at least as good, sometimes better. We need to facilitate the deepening and widening of agroecological farming practices in order to stop climate change and the ecological destruction of the biophysical resources upon which farming depends. This means transforming our farming systems into ones that optimize the sustainable use of low-impact local resources, minimizing the use of high-impact farm technologies, sustaining soils and micronutrients, adopting farm inputs and output choices which reflect local ecosystems and not global commodity markets, sustaining and enhancing crop yields so as to increase agricultural surpluses. We need to build agroecology for several reasons. First of all, very importantly, it's more labor intensive. We live in a world in which increasingly the economic growth which takes place is jobless. And an important source of jobs is agroecological farming. But agroecological farming is also far more resilient to environmental shocks and far more resilient to economic shocks. And it's also important to say that historically, agroecological systems have been the foundation of local communities and local food systems, which have used mechanisms of social reciprocity to ensure adequate, nutritious, and culturally appropriate food for all. Historically, food systems did guarantee a right to food. We can build a food system that sustains the ecology of the planet and meets the challenge of a growing population. So we need to address that as an issue. And that's the sort of thing which the remaining 3 lectures, in fact, will go into because Eric Holt-Jimenez is very knowledgeable about this, and Jules Pretty is as well. The second point that I want to finish on is to go back to where I started on population. 10 billion people, 10.9 billion people can sound like a lot of people. Many people worry about a world of 10 billion. I don't think a world of 10 billion is to be feared. The thing that surprises UN researchers now is not the population projections they make into the future. What surprises them is the speed with which the decline in population momentum is taking place in developing countries. The global rate of population growth is slowing at a historically unprecedented rate. We use the fertility rate to try and look at population growth. The fertility rate, that's the number of live births per 1,000 women between the age of 15 and 44. And a fertility rate of 2.1, so women having just over 2 children on average, will hold a population stable. Currently, the fertility rate for the world is 2.5, and for most countries, it's less than 3. By 2050, only 51 countries in the world will have fertility rates in excess of 2.1. The fastest rate of growth of population in human history was 1972. Rates of population growth have been in decline systemically since 1972. A very little known fact is that the world has already reached peak children. We currently have 1.9 billion children in the world, people under 15. That number will go up, but when you get to 2100 again, the number of children in the world will be 1.9 billion, the same number that we have now. Much of this decline in population growth has been driven by China, with an official fertility rate of only 1.8 for more than 15 years. Until this change in this new decision by the third plenum last week, China's population would be estimated to drop by 450 million people between 2025 and 2100. This is one of the reasons why the Chinese have eased the one-child policy. This decline in population growth brings with it three issues which we don't talk about enough. It's not hunger. In 2010, 7.6% of the world's population is over 65. By 2100, 22.3% will be over the age of 65. Who is going to support them? I'll be dead, but many of you won't be. Second problem is that China and India, because of sex-selective abortion, already have major discrepancies in their sex ratios, far more males than females. And this discrepancy is expected to worsen, with the social consequences being that tens of millions of men will not be able to marry in societies where social premiums are placed upon this. And the third issue is that Africa is going to grow from 1 billion people now to 3.6 billion by 2100. And of course, because sub-Saharan Africa is the epicenter of very high hunger, this has very important implications for global equity. But for parts of the world, such as sub-Saharan Africa, where fertility rates remain above replacement, which is not all of sub-Saharan Africa, I would stress, we know what the key is to reducing fertility. It's growth in incomes. It's improved female education. And it's the availability of reproductive health services. You bring these in, and population growth momentum slows very rapidly. The best example we have is Bangladesh over the past 20 years. This isn't rocket science, it's social science. You shouldn't be sanguine about the impact of population growth on the planet. I'm not suggesting that. But barring this changing planetary distribution of population and this increase in sub-Saharan Africa's share, many parts of the world are going to face population pressures in the form of an aging population, which we're going to need people to support them. It's not going to be an issue that we have to worry about 10.9 billion people. But the issue is, how are we going to look after people who are getting older? Thank you.